recording for other people to benefit. And inshallah, during the Q&A time, I'll stop it again. For Q&A, if you'd like to send questions anonymously, there's a Slido group number that was sent to you all that you can use to send any questions. If I can have the committee members go around, because there's definitely more people than this, start telling people to come inside. Thank you. All right, so I want to take you all down memory lane way back when to around the, let's say, around the 7th century CE, Common Era. This is when this new religion called Islam is starting to have a global international presence. And they start reaching the borders of Syria, what's now Syria, Iran, Egypt, and whatnot. And at this time, the Roman Empire still existed, but it was having a lot of internal problems. And when the Muslims broke the Roman army twice in the northern part of, or I guess the southern part of the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, it was only a few years later where the Roman Empire just completely collapsed. And at that time, Europe was Christian. They've already adopted Christian entirely. And one of the things that the church did was to consider science to be anti-Christian, that science somehow fundamentally goes against Christianity. And therefore, there was a lot of pressure from the church to ban really science and scientific endeavor. And that moment right there marks the beginning of what we call today the Dark Ages, where the western part specifically, the western part of Europe, what we now know as France, Spain, England, Portugal, Germany, they went through centuries, not 100 years, not centuries of very difficult circumstances, economically, health-wise. It was terrible. Like, it's so bad that even till this day, Westerners and people who understand Western history, they have a type of phobia. There's a fear that the Western world will go back to that era. And that goes on for several centuries until the new era, a new era of Europe enters what we now call the Renaissance. What was the Renaissance? The Renaissance was essentially a revival of science. And in it is the Enlightenment movement. And you have many very prominent Western philosophers who come about. People like Descartes, people like Rousseau, people like Voltaire, among others, whose philosophies have shaped the Western world that we live in today, and that goes about and of influencing the global community. And when the Enlightenment philosophers started to preach and give their philosophies, they were very at odds with the church. And the church by that time has done a lot of heinous crimes, a lot of oppression, caused a lot of problems in European society. And so the Enlightenment movement was a type of rebellion against that, or an attempt to fundamentally reform the church itself. And so what you find in these people's philosophies, these philosophers that I just mentioned, they completely exclude God from our day-to-day affairs. God has no place in the world, even though they believed in his existence. Right? What was once an impossible idea, an unimaginable position to say that God doesn't exist, has with time become the norm. What was once completely immoral has become the norm. Now, America has a little bit of a different history, although it kind of met up with the Europeans. And that is, if you look at videos from the 60s. The other day I saw a video from the 60s where women see for the first time a revealing dress. A dress that reveals the chest, not like the entire chest, but the upper chest of a woman. And the camera's rolling and they're asking these ladies, would you wear a dress like that? And they said, absolutely not. Who would? And they even made statements like only a prostitute would wear something like this. Now, in our times today, that type of dress is not just acceptable, it would probably be seen as very appropriate in comparison to other dresses that we find today. So the question is, how on earth did we go as America, as Americans, how did we go from a pretty conservative society in the 60s to a society that pretty much has no concept of moral and immoral in 60 years? What happened? Well, let's go back 60 years, and that is the 1960s. The whole hippie movement, Berkeley, and all the protests that went out, it all happened here. And to be very thorough, right, the what's called the sexual revolution of the 60s couldn't have happened unless the already accepted morals of Christianity had eroded. It was no longer interesting. It was no longer felt as relevant. With technologies coming out, with a different style of governance coming out, slowly but surely, the place of God in the average person's mind and heart became increasingly irrelevant, increasingly distant. That people could no longer see God's hand in the creation. Rather, all that they could see is science. Everything is explained with science. In school, all you're taught is science. Why are there mountains? You have a scientific explanation to it. Why does it rain? You have a scientific explanation to it. Why does a person die? Well, you have a scientific explanation to it. And even us as Muslims living here, it's not easy to see how Allah plays a role in these what we think are very normal phenomenon in the world. Right? So you already have this happening. And in the 1960s, you have the introduction of the birth control pill. Now, the birth control pill began in the 1930s, but it was distrusted. People didn't accept it. It was in the 1960s where it was kind of perfected, and it became known that it's effective. This stuff actually works. And now, for the first time in human history, societies are able to, to split sexuality from family roles. Sexuality is no longer seen as the venue of reproduction. It has other functions now. You can do this stuff without fear of repercussions, or else sexuality has had this internal and this mechanism of deterrence, where a woman isn't interested in doing that outside of marriage because of the extreme consequences of doing such an act. But now with the pill, oh, it's open season. Anybody and everybody can do this without consequences. And now society's understanding of sexuality begins to slowly change. We can do this without repercussions. I don't need to be married to do this because I don't have to worry about the consequences. And so here you have what's called the sexual revolution. And the whole movements on all of this, part of it, right, was to normalize sexuality outside of marriage. It begins with this. And with time, slowly one thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing, leads to another thing. Did you know in the 80s, when the 80s, the decade I was born in, it was still taboo. It was still taboo for a man and a woman who are not married to live together. Imagine that. Now, in our times today, it is the norm. It's almost like this is part of life. Just like going to school is part of life, everybody does it. Living with the opposite gender or with a partner before marriage is a norm. You kind of do it. You have to. It's part of getting married. Look at how we went from one thing to another. And now, what they call the second sexual revolution of our times today is to disconnect emotions and emotional commitment to relationships and sexuality. It's kind of just free game. You go and you hook up, and a one-night thing, everybody's happy, they go home. You see how all of this kind of one step to another to another. This begins the stage for a new way of understanding the self. And so, what are some of the consequences of the sexual revolution? Well, one, the removal of social stigma around premarital sex. Back in the day, it's bad. Like in all societies. This isn't just an Islamic thing. All societies across the world viewed sex outside of marriage to be completely unacceptable, inappropriate, harmful. But with the pill, that idea changes. Another consequence, identity begins to be formed around sexuality. When you think of a hippie, what are some of the stereotypes that come to your mind? Someone who smokes weed and someone who's very lovey-dovey, right? But not just lovey-dovey, I love you. No, all that goes with love. It's a type of stereotype. And so you have the beginning of formulating identity around sexuality. Another consequence, sexual acts themselves have no intrinsic moral significance. You just do it, something you do. It's like going and having a meal. When you eat, you just kind of eat. You're hungry, you eat, that's it. It's not an issue of morality. Now, sexuality used to be a very huge issue of morality. Now, it's not. Nobody's shocked that when so and so and so and so hook up. No, they just kind of did it, whatever. There's no intrinsic moral value to it. And number four, abolishing any morality which suppresses your sexual feelings. So the whole hippie movement, all that movement, a lot of it was pushing back against traditional standards, traditional norms. And now anybody who tries to push back against these moralities, against this type of lifestyle, is seen as an oppressor. We have to fight against that. We have to make sexual expression as accessible as possible. And you're seeing this even in books and how they're trying to show you, yeah, all this stuff is good and do it, and this is how you do it safely. It's become so normalized. And now, right and wrong when it comes to sexuality is determined not based on intrinsic morality, not based on consequences, not based on what's harmful and beneficial, but rather based on consent. Consent. So long as the relationship is consensual, the two parties are okay with it, you're A-okay. Now, this is extremely problematic. Extremely problematic. Why? Because there's so many holes when it comes to this whole concept of consent. Let me give you some examples. Who's truly old enough to consent? How old do you have to be to consent? When a 5-year-old goes to, let's say, a local convenience store and wants to buy a lollipop and gives the store owner some money, are they old enough to buy something? What do you mean, no? They are. Right? I don't think a store owner is going to say, no, you can't buy a lollipop, go get your parents. I remember back when I was young, 5, 6, 7 years, we used to walk to what's called White Hen, the convenience store. We used to buy things and go home. No one told us, oh, you're too young. Who's old enough to have consent? It begs the question. And so, if a 12-year-old girl has the right to consent to a sexual reassignment surgery without a parent's permission, right? So this is the law now. A 12-year-old has the legal right to undergo a surgery that will cut off some of their body parts and permanently change this person. They can do it at 12 without their parents' permission. Right? Why can't she, the 12-year-old girl, consent to a relationship with a 60-year-old man? I'm not asking a question, man. Think about it. If they have the maturity to change their sex, their biological sex, causing permanent consequences on their body, they have the legal right to do it. They are old enough to consent to that. Are they not old enough to consent to having a relationship with a 60-year-old man? If the answer is no, they don't have, okay, why? Why? What's the difference? Why is they're old enough to have consent here, but they're not old enough to have consent here? It's inconsistent. Another example. If consent is what makes an act okay, then what's wrong with two siblings engaging in this? Do people accept this? No. Even those who promote LGBT, they don't accept this. So if it's about consent and consent is what makes things okay, what if a brother and a sister consent? Why is that suddenly wrong? Why is that taboo? Why is that inappropriate? Why is that banned? Can a brother and sister get married in this country? No. Why not? No, seriously. If consent, a 12-year-old can consent to surgery, why can't she consent to a legal marriage? Why is it not allowed for her, a 12-year-old, to get legally married? It's inconsistent. Okay, if a man is married, a married man goes and has a consensual relationship with another woman who's not his wife, isn't that wrong? Well, it's consensual, so why is it wrong? Right? So you see how problematic of a framework this is? If you consent, it's okay. That's what it's become down. That's what it's come down to. And so what we have here, as a result of all of this, the current paradigm suggests that identity, actions, and feelings are interconnected. Meaning, if you feel a certain way, that justifies the action. And if you act a certain way, then that is your identity. And if you feel a certain way, that is your identity. This is called the cyclicalization of the human being, of identity. Meaning you are what you think. And this is Descartes, by the way, this is Descartes' quote, this famous quote. I think, therefore what? I am. That's his statement. This is where all of this goes back to. I think, therefore I am. Meaning my identity is based on the fact that I think. And if my identity goes back to my thinking, then I am what I think. Hence, if somebody thinks they're gay, that's their identity. If someone thinks, questions are at the end, Ammar. If someone thinks that they're a lesbian, that's who they are. If someone is a biological male but thinks they are a female, they suddenly become a female. So quickly that a person can literally go from male to female, an infinite amount of times in one day. Just because they think it. I mean, can you imagine what the state of a person is when they begin to identify just based on feelings? Well, there are some people who walk around as dogs. Can they identify as dogs? There are some people, I mean, seriously, I don't mean to be controversial, but what happens when a white man begins to identify as black? Can he do that? No, he can't do that. Why? Well, why not? If aren't you what you think you are? Well, I think I'm black. Why are you denying me my identity? Doesn't make any sense. Or I think I am, Fir'aun said, "Ana rabbukum al-a'la," didn't he? He said, "I am your Lord Supreme." Does that make him our Lord Supreme? Just because he thinks that? Absolutely not. Right? And so the cyclicalization of the human being is where we're at today. You think, therefore you are. And this is really unhealthy. And to look at the sexual revolution from an Islamic lens, let's analyze it from the Islamic position. Although Islam promotes family and truly, it paints a positive image for reproduction and children. Al-malu wal-banun zinatul hayat ad-dunya. Money and wealth are the adornments of life. And the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to have children, so that there are more Muslims on earth. It's a beautiful thing. The Prophet ﷺ says, any person, any parent who has two daughters and takes care of their daughters and is kind to their daughters and raises them and until they get married, then their daughters will be a protection for them on the day of judgment. And one of the huge rewards that we can leave behind is a good child who continues to make dua for us. So having children is a very positive thing in Islam. But it's not the only reason people get married. Islam acknowledges this. And Islam says, the Quran says, among Allah's blessings that He created for a man a female, and for the female a male. Why? Well, in this particular verse, not so that they have a bunch of babies, but so that they find peace with each other. They find love with each other. They find, mercy with one another. So you also have that emotional bond. That's a blessing, and that is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So sexuality in Islam, yeah, part of it is for reproduction, having children. That's a great blessing. But it's not exclusive to that. You also have that romantic side of it. But at the same time, Islam is going to come and explain that you aren't something just because you think it. It's not the way it works. A person's identity is separate from their actions, is separate from their thoughts. And so when it comes to our thoughts, yeah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, hey, be careful. Not all of your thoughts are yours. Some of your thoughts are yours. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ وَنَعْلَمُ مَا تُوَسْوِسُ بِهِ نَفْسُهُ. We created humanity and we know what they whisper to themselves. So some of it is from yourself. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says that sometimes the shaitan is whispering to you. فَوَسْوَسَ لَهُمَا الشَّيْطَانِ. The shaitan went and he whispered to Adam and Hawa. Not all of your thoughts are yours. And sometimes thoughts are actually from the angels, right? To help you do good. So not all of your thoughts are yours. And just because you think something doesn't make it right. Just because you think something doesn't make it true. Just because you think something doesn't make it healthy. Just because you think something doesn't make it halal. Just because you think something doesn't make it your identity. Same thing with your actions. You have examples in the time of the Prophet ﷺ of people who did major sins. But they weren't defined. Their identity didn't become, oh, that person's a drunkard, or that person's a fornicator. That's not their identity. That's an action that they did. And the Prophet ﷺ teaches us to appreciate our fellow brother or sister who believes in Allah, who believes in His Messenger. Appreciate the fact that they're still your brother or sister in Islam. Appreciate the fact that they are still a human being. That's the identity Allah gives us. When you look at the Quran and you ask the question, what identity is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributing to the human being? Number one, your humanness. The fact that you are a human being. And guess what? Can you change your humanness? That's a fact. You are a human being. Whether you identify that way or not, it doesn't change the fact that you are a human being. You can't change that, period. It's permanent. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributes value to. And Allah praises Himself for creating the human being and saying what a wonderful creation the human being is. It's a positive thing, it's not a negative thing. That's our identity. And no matter how many bad things a person does, it doesn't degrade them from being a human being. Hence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ. O person who has transgressed all boundaries, all red lines, meaning they have gone as far astray as you can ever imagine when it comes to their humane nature. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't despair. You can come back. And so once a human, always a human. Once a human, you can always go back to that humanness. And our dignity, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Your dignity comes from the fact that you are a human being. Why? Because Allah created you. That's where your identity comes from. And Allah gives us a second identity, and that is your Islam. That is your Islam. The fact that you were created with an innate submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether you accept it or not, whether you act upon it or not. And notice something, not everybody acts upon their Islam. Not everybody acts as a Muslim. But the fact of the matter is, the Prophet says, كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ يُولَدُ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ. Every human being is born initially as a Muslim. But that disposition is tainted, it's adulterated, it's corrupted. The fact of the matter is, it's still in every single human being. They have the opportunity to go back to it. This is our identity. And no matter how much a person thinks otherwise, it doesn't change it because it's a permanent fact. It's a permanent reality, right? And by the way, just because someone thinks they're a Muslim, does it make him a Muslim? No. And if a Muslim starts thinking, man, am I really a Muslim, or maybe I'm not a Muslim? It doesn't change the fact that they are still a Muslim. I sometimes get this question, by the way, from people. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, help us all. People who have OCD. Am I really a Muslim? Maybe today I'm not a Muslim. I tell them, you are a Muslim, no matter how many times your thoughts tell you otherwise. And so when it comes to identity, we don't believe in the psycholization of the self. We believe that we are a human that has a body, and our bodies have rights over us. We are a mind, and our minds have rights over us. And we are a soul, and our soul has rights over us. Our role as humans and as Muslims is to synchronize all three of these. Because when someone starts thinking in a way that contradicts what they see right in front of them, that's a mental health problem. That's a mental health problem. That's not freedom. That's not progress. That's not wisdom. That's not human rights. That is a mental health problem, whether they want to say it is or not. We're going to say it as we believe it, right? Also, Islam does not equate feelings to identity. Rather, feelings, action are separate. So if somebody were to feel that they are Muslim, that doesn't make them a Muslim. If someone feels like murdering someone and constantly thinks about it, that doesn't make them a murderer, nor does it justify the act. Further, similarly, if someone feels a certain sexuality, it doesn't mean that their identity, it doesn't mean that that's their identity, nor does it mean that it's normal. It's not normal. So those people who are waving the rainbow flag and we just want to make our kids feel safe. We want to make sure everybody feels safe. Yeah, we're all for that. But by embracing something that's harmful to them, you're harming them. You're not benefiting them. You're not. Right? This modern movement is unprecedented in human history. And for somebody to come and say, we have made the most progress and we are the most advanced human beings, that is arrogance. What all the trillions of people who have walked this earth before, they're all idiots and they're all bigots and they're all fools. What arrogance is that, man? That is the epitome of arrogance. They have wisdoms. Right? And not everybody's an evil person. There's this paradigm, all those people are evil. They all suck. That's why they never reach where we are. MashaAllah, we're so holy. Look at the arrogance. Look at the self-righteous. And look at how conceited people have become, self-absorbed they've become. And so here we have I'm oversimplifying the conversation, but we have a trajectory. How did we come here? And by the way, something else that I forgot to mention when it comes to the trajectory of what got us here is feminism. No, feminism isn't what caused the LGBT movement. And I'm not trying to say that feminism is evil entirely. Some parts are, as we've discussed before. But one of the things that feminism did, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So I'm not saying that, I'm not making a moral statement here. But one of the consequences of feminism, whether intentional or unintentional, was this changing of gender roles. Now, again, we've spoken about this before in previous sessions, right? Islam has a separate paradigm than what we're seeing in the West. The West is all over the place when it comes to people. They're all over the place. So what the West believes is feminine might not overlap with what Islam believes is feminine, right? Same thing with masculinity. And when it comes to gender roles, what the West is saying or has said is gender roles might not overlap with what Islam says. But one of the consequences of feminism is this changing of gender roles. And when gender no longer is identified, it's no longer clear, it opens a Pandora box. Right? So one thing leads to another, it leads to another, it leads to another, and now we are where we are. And so when we ask the question, LGBT, is it truly science? Is it truly normal? Or is it an infiltration? Part of it, you can see how it's a naturally unnatural, although problematic, a natural progression. You see how one thing leads to another, leads to another. How opening one door leads to another door, leads to another door. But now we're having this bizarre rise, this bizarre pushing of this ideology. Tell me, what percentage of Americans are black? Does anyone know? Can someone Google it real quickly? 16%? Huh? Yeah. 12 to 16, 20, whatever it is. How long have blacks been in this country? How long have blacks been in this country? Since the birth of America, since the 1600s. Have the blacks gone through and continue to go through plights and oppression and problematic laws and unfair treatment? Yeah? Yeah. Haven't there been huge movements for the rights of blacks and making sure things are more fair and accessible for them? Yeah? Have they found the same success over 400 years than the LGBT have found in the past 30? How? Why? Do you understand where I'm coming from here? There's something unnatural about the progression. There's something going on here. And the question is, what? Now, here, as a caveat, these are my theories, all right? You do your own research. I could be 100% right, I can be 100% wrong, or I could be 50-50, right? So don't listen to what I'm saying now as this is authentic and 100% accurate information. These are things to consider. Is there an attempt to infiltrate the average individual and change the way they view the human being? I'm going to say yes. Who are they? Well, you have a subset from the LGBT community who are radicals. Every group has radicals, don't they? We Muslims, don't we have radicals? The answer is yes. Do Christians have radicals? Yes. Do Jews have radicals? Yes. Do atheists have radicals? Yes. Do Americans have radicals? Yes. Do French have radicals? Every society, every religion has radicals. And the LGBT community is no different. You have radicals among them. And I've called them the resentful members, the resentful members of the LGBT community. Not all of them, some of them. And they have a mission to literally corrupt you. Don't take it from me. They have a book called After the Ball. This is a book. After the Ball, How America Will Conquer Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the 90s. Read it. And this is a direct quote. I'm quoting directly. The campaign we outlined in this book, though complex, so they have an entire campaign, steps, though complex, depends centrally upon, pay attention, their attempt to change American society, to accept LGBT, depends centrally upon a program of unabashed propaganda. This is their wording. Propaganda, firmly grounded in long established principles of psychology and advertising. Meaning they're going to exploit human psychology, they're going to use advertising strategies, and man, the Western world, when it comes to advertising, they are extremely advanced. It's become so advanced that these companies no longer have to tell you what their product is. All they have to do is show you their symbol, that's it. A Nike commercial, do they ever explain their product? You see the shoe, but what's going on in the commercial? You have an athlete talking about how I'm pushing the status quo and I'm challenging myself, and it's inspirational stuff, but it's strong, effective advertising. They don't even need to sell you the product. Why? Because they've created an identity. So they use psychology, they use advertising. A glued of gay-related advertising presented in the least offensive fashion possible. So now we begin to understand that all the media that's going, all these commercials, every commercial now has LGBT in it. And when you look at these commercials, notice something. Again, I know advertising these days is very selective and it kind of studies your algorithm and what you like and what not. But the commercials I see on YouTube, I never find a man who is straight. They're always gay men. Always. And every commercial has to have some sort of homosexuality in it, no matter what it is. This is exactly what they're saying. Is there infiltration? They're saying it themselves. They are saying this. We're going to infiltrate media and advertising to normalize this stuff. And you probably saw this YouTube video titled A Message from the Gay Community, performed by the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir. You all see this? YouTube it. The guy sings, right? And I'm quoting, this is word for word. The guy sings the following: "You think we'll corrupt your kids if our agenda goes unchecked? Funny, just this once, you're correct." Do I need to repeat that? The guy said, I'm going to repeat it. "You think we'll corrupt your kids if our agenda goes unchecked?" He's singing this. "Funny, just this once, you're correct. We'll convert your children, happening bit by bit, quiet, and suddenly, you will barely notice it." So you have a subset of radicals who are trying to harm society. They are trying to convert people. So when you see this song, this guy singing this song, and you see what's going on in the schools, and you see the legislation that's being passed, you cannot but start connecting the dots. There's something else going on here, right? And again, I emphasize this is a subset of the LGBT community. We don't have a goal, we don't have a mission, nor is it appropriate, wise, or part of Islamic etiquettes and manners to demonize any people. But when you have devils like this, blatantly, publicly saying these things, no, we have to stand our ground. We have to stand our ground because that's what the prophets did. If you want to be our enemy, you started that. You started that. And we will stand up and we will use whatever legal venues we have available to us in this country. So we're not calling to anything illegal, we're not calling to violence, but we are going to recognize an enemy who blatantly says it. Right? And so notice how similar this is to the people of Lut. When you look at the people of Lut alayhi salam, they had an agenda of corrupting society. Hence, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the story of Lut alayhi salam, it was primarily men engaging in sodomy. But interestingly enough, when Allah describes the people of Lut, He describes them all. إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا قَوْمَ سَوْءٍ فَاسِقِينَ. The entire people of that society, men and women, were an evil people. Not only that, when they heard, I'm kind of paraphrasing the story here, when they heard, the people of Lut heard that Lut alayhi salam has 3 guests. There are 3 men who are very handsome in his home. What does Allah describe? What does He say the scene is? He says, وَجَاءَ أَهْلُ الْمَدِينَةِ يَسْتَبْشِرُونَ. The entirety of the village went. The entirety, men, women, and children. So what you find is that when homosexuality begins to arise, it begins to foment, it tends to start with the men, right? Now the men have to, I was saying this in the Q&A session earlier, the men, if they're engaging in this, well, there's a problem now, because what about all these women? They have their needs, don't they? If the men are just satisfying their sexual desires with other men, what are these women going to do? They have their rights as well. And so the men say, man, we have to deal with this, or else they're going to keep agitating us, and it's going to destroy our entire, fun. So what do? They start targeting women to encourage them to fall into lesbianism, to occupy their time with other women. They corrupt. And they start corrupting children as well. So you see what the people of Lut alayhi salam were doing. These extremists within the LGBT community are doing the same thing. History repeats itself, doesn't it? So we do see that there's a subset from this community, right? Don't demonize the entire community. We have Islamic morals, we have our Islamic principles. There's a courteous, prophetic way we deal with people. But when people are openly, showing us their fangs, we're not going to sit there and ignore, oh, they're loving people. They just want love for everybody. No, you don't want love for everybody. You clearly have an agenda. We're not going to stop, right? So you have infiltration that end. Now, where's all the money coming from? Someone Google, how many billions of dollars is being funded in promoting LGBT? Billions. Where's all this coming from? Where? You think billions of dollars come out of nowhere? Why is Target so adamant about pushing this? While Walmart and Costco, no. We have to ask the question, why? Now again, this is all my theory. 300 billion. Right? That's just by the government. All right? 300 billion each year. 300 billion. What is the defense budget? $1 trillion, right? I mean, the defense budget to defend 320 million Americans is only 3 times, a little over 3 times the amount of promoting LGBT. Like, what on earth? Where's all this money coming from? Why is our government putting so much money in this without putting the same amount of money in helping other causes that are even more important? How many homeless people are there? How much money goes to funding unhoused people? Look that up as well. It's weird, it's bizarre. And again, this is my theory. I could be 100% right, I could be 100% wrong. Do you all remember Jeffrey Epstein? Yeah? What was going on in his island? Right? You know about this? Pedophilia, human trafficking, sex trafficking. Who visited that island? Hmm? Who? Give me names. Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, who else? Trump, what? Oprah was there? Seriously? Why am I not surprised? Right? Look at the people who go there. They ain't no nobodies. These are powerful and wealthy people who have billions and can influence billions, right? Now, if Jeffrey Epstein and his island are being accused of human trafficking and sex with minors, and you have these people there, what were they doing there? What? Isn't it very likely that they were there? And if they're doing these things, yes or no? Is that possible? Yeah? Okay, now there's an open investigation on this island, and one of Epstein's closest accomplices is in prison now. Do you think the FBI and the Interpol and they're not looking into this? And if these billionaires and these princes and all these wealthy people are guilty of that, do you not think they're going to fund billions into LGBT lobby to slowly legalize sex with what we call now minors? Hence, legislation. If you're 12-year-old, you can get your sex changed, right? If you're 12 years old. So who's to say that they're not putting legislation on a track to make consent at the age of 12? And then once things spill, it's legal now. Isn't that possible? Where's all this money coming from? Follow the money, take it from Chris Tucker. Follow the rich person, although he was a little bit more stereotypical than that. Follow the money. Where's all this money coming from? So it's very possible that you have these shady people who are trying to hide their crimes and legalize their crimes, and they put billions into this agenda. That maybe starts to answer the question, why is Target so adamant about pushing this stuff? Well, maybe somebody in the CEs or the COs of the company was there on that island. Now, again, everybody's innocent until proven guilty. So be careful. Don't go around saying Bill Gates is a pedophile or innocent until proven guilty. But if they were there, there's suspicion now, right? So here's another possibility that this stuff is infiltration. It's being pushed in an unnatural way, being shoved down our throats. Why? To hide their crimes or to legalize their crimes. Another type of infiltration that we are seeing is that the Western world, Western politics, Western governments will use human rights as a tool of war. About a year ago or so, Afghanistan and the government of Afghanistan banned women from going to school. Remember this? Yeah? Now, let's be very clear, we don't like that. Right? We want women to be educated. We want them to have equal access to education. Right? What did America do in response to that? They put sanctions on Afghanistan under the guise of human rights that resulted in literally starving the entirety of the country. Is that championing human rights or is that tyranny? That's tyranny. Now you have, as I said in the khutbah, America wants to put sanctions on Uganda. Lukmanza people. They want to put sanctions on Uganda. Why? Because the Ugandan president made a statement that homosexuality, this stuff is banned in his country. Do you really think America is placing sanctions because they are champions of human rights, or is it a darn useful tool to punish a people. It's useful. Do you really think any political figure really cares about this stuff? The role of a president or a king or whoever, a chancellor, whoever it is to protect and to promote and to strengthen their country. And they will use every tool possible. Politics is a vicious game. It is a dark game. So don't think politicians, and I'm not just talking about American, I'm talking about globally. Don't think they have good hearts. They're just trying to champion human rights. That's not the case. Look at the World Cup and all that stuff. Do you really think these athletes care that much about this issue? Do you really think they care that much? Do you think the governments care that much about this issue? Or is it darn useful to try and harm and agitate Muslims? So they will use LGBT to get their agenda going. They used us, didn't they? The war on terror. You all were maybe too young for that. This war on terror created a propaganda machine that justified entering into Afghanistan and entering into Iraq and literally destabilizing two stable countries, leading to the deaths of millions of people under the guise of what? We're fighting terror. And now LGBT is the new thing. In defense of human rights, we're going to invade your country. It's a useful tool. So again, there is a side of LGBT that we understand where it's coming from. The change in philosophies, the change in the structure of societies, the change in technologies, where you can say it's, although inappropriate and unhealthy, you see a natural trajectory, right? But there are other dark players, evil people, who probably can care less about homosexuality, who probably think it's funny, right? Dave Chappelle, he's the one who said, when I'm hanging out with rich people, he himself heard white rich people making fun of the poor whites. There are evil people out there, evil people who will use something like LGBT and the struggles, the sincere struggles of individuals as their tool to do what they want. And they will fund money to protect their own backs, even at the expense of broader society. So yes, there's a serious struggle that's come in a type of natural way in evolution or progress of human society, but don't be blind to the other side of this. Right? Don't be blind to it. We want good for everybody. We passionately hold our stance that homosexuality is unhealthy and it is immoral and it is harmful to those who practice it and to the societies that embrace it. But at the same time, our mission, our position as Muslims is that of the Prophet ﷺ. We want the best for all people. We are concerned for all people. We want compassion for all people. But when somebody shows their fangs, and they're full of venom, I'm not going to let you bite me. I'm not going to go and hug a snake. A snake is my enemy, right? So you all are under a tremendous amount of pressure. And that pressure might even increase more once you get into the workforce. But understand an enemy for an enemy. And don't fall for the propaganda, right? And so to conclude, the ultimate challenge of this topic is that the current LGBT movement wants us to believe that sexual desires and behaviors are primarily questions of equality, dignity, and human rights, and that any opposition to the goals of LGBT constitutes opposition to equality, dignity, and human rights. This is not the case. It's not true, right? Human rights revolve around things that are intrinsic to the human being. You can understand if a society is oppressing, let's say, women, how that is a human rights issue because being a female is part of being human. You can't change that. You can understand how racism is against a race, an ethnicity. You can understand there's nothing a white person or a black person or an Arab or a South Asian or an Asian can do to change their ethnicity. They're born that way. There's nothing a person can do to change their gender. They're born that way. And so targeting a person for something they have no control over, that's evil. That is racism. That is a human rights issue. But actions These are issues of moral and immoral, right and wrong. You cannot say somebody is right or wrong for being of a certain skin color. You can't say somebody's moral, immoral for being a certain gender or being at a certain age. There's nothing you could do about that. But morality, immorality, right, wrong, ethical, unethical is in our actions. LGBT is a serious problem. And we're not going to create a framework like the far right, because that's also a problem. We're not seeking to create a war against anybody, let alone the LGBT community. We want a dialogue. We want to discuss. We want to share our position. If you think it's good, alhamdulillah. If they think it's not good, lakum dinukum waliya din. You have your ways, I have my ways. Right? And I repeat, Islam doesn't give us the moral duty to force other people to accept our moral paradigm. We ask them to reciprocate that. You do what you want to do. We disagree with it. Don't shove it down my throat. And if I disagree with it, I am disagreeing with something that is an action that you can choose to do or you can choose not to do. That's not a human right issue. That is an issue of morality. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to, inshallah, help us and guide us and always keep us straight on the straight path. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no pun intended, right? No pun intended, to keep us on the straight path. And again, you know, the point of this talk, I know I'm very passionate about this. I know I'm very upfront about it. I'm not trying to offend anybody. I'm not trying to harm anybody. It comes from a compassionate and good intending heart, although people might disagree with me in terms of what I say. And so Slido is available to send questions. You're more than welcome to raise your hand. But if you feel more comfortable, if you feel more comfortable to ask anonymously, you also have that option as well. So look at the Slam Corner group chat. You'll have the link for it. Inshallah. If anyone has any questions, you go ahead and raise your hand. Yazan, can you? Yeah, thank you. Yazan, go ahead.